We humans tend to think that we have things under control. We pride ourselves in human accomplishment. I mean, we've gone to the moon and back, and the next thing is going to be the planet Mars. And those are amazing accomplishments. The age in which we're living is filled with incredible achievements, and we're able as a human race to do things that were never thought possible before. I can take my smartphone, I can enter the year and the make of my car, and I can have an app or a website find the part I need for my car, order it over the phone, and in a couple of days I will find it sitting on my porch. I can do the same thing and find a pizza on my porch. What's something that really amazes you that is a feature of our society today? We live in an incredible time. All of that achievement, though, can go to our collective heads. What I mean is, we sometimes can start thinking as a whole, we've got this. We have all the answers, or we have Google and YouTube so we can find all the answers. And then a submicroscopic infectious agent, a virus, reproduces by the trillions, travels the globe, and hits the emergency brake on the world economy, among other things. Whether or not it's directly from the hand of God really doesn't change this fact that our collective pride has been brought down a few notches by a virus. That same story of being brought low a few notches has been repeated a million times over through whole countries and in the lives of some individuals. It's told in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4. I'd like you to get your Bibles open to Daniel chapter 4. Let's look there together this morning and look at verse 4. Daniel records there, verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. Now remember, the whole message of the book of Daniel is laid out in a single line here in chapter 4. It appears in verse 17 and verse 25 and verse 32. It says the same thing there 3 times. Know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets it over the lowliest of men. Now for a moment today, I want you to walk through this account with me and see how that is very true, and then I want us to walk away from this story with something for us to do. Remember, first of all, that King Nebuchadnezzar is a real person in real history who lived in the 7th century BC, before Jesus was born, and he lived in a part of the world that is today called Iraq. Nebuchadnezzar has been labeled the greatest of all kings of the Babylonian Empire. In fact, possibly the greatest of all kings of the East in general. After some years of subduing his enemies, Nebuchadnezzar set out to build, and build he did, the city of Babylon and the surrounding area. In fact, 90% of Babylon and 95% of all the other ruins that cover that part of the world are made up with bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name. Here's a brick. You can read along. Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. You've heard of Babylon. It was Nebuchadnezzar who saw its rebuilding. That great city that spanned the Euphrates River, surrounded by an 11-mile long wall. The inner wall of Babylon was so wide that 2 chariots could ride alongside each other on top of it. The most famous of its 8 gates was the one that passed into Nebuchadnezzar's inner palace, the Ishtar Gate. Somewhere nearby were the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the great wonders of the ancient world. The city was also filled with temples to Babylon's gods. And Nebuchadnezzar describes his devotion to them and the building that he had accomplished, all the things that he had done. That it's on a stone slab, 22-inch tall slab that has become known as the East India House inscription. It was discovered in 1803. Here's a picture of it. I'm not going to read the whole inscription of these, the whole translation of these 10 columns of cuneiform. I will just tell you this, though. I did look this up. The word I occurs 134 times in the English translation. Was Nebuchadnezzar proud? Yes, very much so. After all, he had accomplished an awful lot as a king. So jump ahead in the chapter 4, to verse 29. He was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence, and for the glory of my majesty? Answer, not really. And here's that point of the whole book again. God is in control. Nebuchadnezzar may have thought that he accomplished all this, but in ways that he wasn't acknowledging, there was much more involved. You see, God is in control of human history, including the accomplishments of great world leaders. Nebuchadnezzar may have thought he had really done something. After all, he commanded the armies, he made the rules, he guided the political scene of his day, right? Maybe. But overseeing all of it was the King of Kings. In fact, listen to how God describes all this through the prophet Jeremiah, who also lived through these times. Jeremiah 27:6. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And I have given him also the beasts of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings shall make him their slave. Interesting, isn't it? God said, I have given these to him. Interesting that God calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. It's important to remember that the story of human history is fit into a bigger divine story that was written and is being written by God. He uses people's choices all through that story, but in the end, human history belongs to God. So occasionally, we find that God steps in and he very actively directs human history. That should always serve as a reminder to us that he's the one that's in control. By steps into human history, I mean the moments when God intervenes, when God completely takes over and he shows himself in ways that are not subtle. Remember, there was a worldwide flood. Everything that lived on land that drew breath died, except for Noah and his family. There was a demonstration of God's control. After the flood, people were building a tower that became known as the Tower of Babel. God stepped in again and he confused their language so that people split up and they moved around to populate different parts of the earth. Years later, there were 5 cities of the plain, 5 cities on a plain nearby each other that had become so wicked, among them Sodom and Gomorrah, God determined to destroy them. And so he burned them up, rained fire and burning sulfur from heaven down on those cities. That was God stepping into human history. The forming of the nation of Israel was also God's really direct work. With no experience, this little nation moved into the land of Canaan and forced out all of the people living there. Israel fought, but all along, and God told them this, it was really God who was in control. You get the picture. God is in control. And that includes in the city of ancient Babylon, and that includes Rockford, Rochelle, Byron, Davis Junction, Loves Park, McChesney Park, Roscoe, Rockton, South Beloit, Winnebago, Belvedere. You get it. Nebuchadnezzar didn't get it. Not until the end of the story. You and I today have the chance to get it before the end of ours. I want you to see in chapter 4 that arrogance will always end in humiliation. The bulk of this chapter, which we don't have time to read in this short time this morning, is about a dream, another dream, that Nebuchadnezzar had. This dream also was from God again and again. Daniel would come to give an interpretation for him. It's a pretty simple dream, just that there was a huge, wonderful tree, and people and animals alike all benefited from this big tree, finding shelter in its branches, shade underneath it, fruit from it. And then an angel of some kind from heaven gives an order for the tree to be chopped down. Its branches are to be lopped off. Its fruit is to be scattered. And then the wording kind of changes in the dream, and we begin to understand that this tree is really a word picture about a person. And the chopping down is really about this person being given a period of time during which he's going to lose all of his glory. He's going to lose his mind and be humiliated. Daniel interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. It's about him. He, Nebuchadnezzar, is that tree. Look in verse 22. And Daniel tells him he is the one who's about to be laid low. Verse 25. You shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. Because God is in control, it's important to learn what Nebuchadnezzar was going to learn. Arrogance will end in humiliation. It was 12 months after this interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar obviously had not listened to the message that God had sent to him. He's walking on his palace roof. He's looking out over the city, over all of his great achievements, and that's okay unless you fail to put credit where it belongs. So Nebuchadnezzar lost his mind. He was cast out from society. He lived like an animal, eating grass, and it happened long enough, we don't know for sure how long, but long enough that his hair grew ridiculously long. It's kind of hard to boast about your greatness when your mouth is full of grass and your hair is all matted. You see, when you're enjoying a blessed life, when you're looking back over accomplishments, when you're well fed, or when you're receiving some recognition for what you've done, that's a really good time to give God glory for all of it. There's a little side note in the book of Acts chapter 12 about a time when King Herod failed to give God recognition for what he had done. On an appointed day, this is in verse 21 of Acts 12, on an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a God, and not of a man." Immediately, an angel of the Lord struck him down, because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. Ew! Why would God strike down a person in a position of authority? Well, according to what happened here, because he did not give God the glory. And why would God do that with worms? The only thing I can come up with is, I think it's for dramatic effect. Makes me worry a bit for a governor who watches the number of coronaviruses drop in his state and then says about that, God did not do that. Faith did not do that. In James chapter 4, we read these words. They're also found both of them taken from the Old Testament. They're also found in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. There was a ruler living in Iraq. He was notably proud and cruel. He wanted, in many ways, to restore the former glory of Babylon. And he saw himself as the one to do it and to be credited with it. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was later hunted down and put to death. We don't have to relive these same mistakes. God put the story of Nebuchadnezzar and of Herod and others in His Word so that we could learn from them and not fall into the same pitfalls they fell into. I expect that applies to us individually and as a community, as a city, a state, and a nation as well. If I could have a hearing with the president, with our governor, with our county commissioners, my message to all of them would be the same. Two things. I would tell them, first of all, I am praying for you. You have a huge task, to be sure, and we're counting on you to do it well, so I am praying for you. And second, in my prayers for you, I am praying that the Lord will help you to have an attitude of humility, so that you will recognize that the task is too great for you to handle on your own, and so that you will continually turn to the Lord for wisdom and help. By the way, let me add that the result of arrogance is more than just humiliation. Usually, humiliation's not fatal. I have managed to survive it many times. I haven't died yet from it. But this is really a much bigger matter. God opposes the proud. Think about that. God opposes the proud, stands against the proud. The end of a person's pride potentially will be more than just humiliation. For instance, those who maintain arrogance have failed to love, because love, remember, is not proud or boastful. Those who maintain arrogance will bring about their own destruction. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about people whom God says deserve to die, and that includes people who are haughty or boastful. Sounds to me like what's at stake here is bigger than just being humiliated. This is a matter of where a person will spend forever. That's something I want to be sure of. There are split opinions about what happened in Nebuchadnezzar's life after this story. These words in chapter 4 are the last words in the Bible from this great king of Babylon. Look it over carefully, and you'll see how this chapter is worded as an official proclamation. It is a public document. Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king, is publicly bowing to God. Verse 34. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time, my reason returned to me. And for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are right, and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. So here's one more thing to walk away with this morning, and that is that humility brings the hope for restoration. Something changed in Nebuchadnezzar. Look again at verse 34. He says, I lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. With his pride completely stripped away, Nebuchadnezzar finally assumed the correct posture. This strange event in the king's life was described by Paul Butler as God in mercy helping him out of a fool's paradise. Have you got some event in your life where you could say the same thing? I know that some of you who are online with us this morning would say, yes, that's me. I was in the fool's paradise. I was headed for deep water. And if I hadn't lost my job, or if I hadn't had the accident, or if my spouse hadn't threatened to leave me, or if I hadn't been caught, or if I hadn't gotten sick, if the crisis hadn't come, I would have gone under. What was that moment in your life? Write it in if you want to share it. I wonder how many stories from the year 2020 are going to sound a bit like this story. I wonder how many lives were headed for a crash that are going to be restored to reason in a way they wouldn't have been otherwise. That change, if it's going to happen, will mean lifting your eyes heavenward. I remember the words that God gave to Israel as the temple was being dedicated by Solomon. He told them in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 13, when I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locust to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. The hope for restoration is there all along, whether it's for a king who is brought low because of his arrogance, or a nation that turns its back on God. The road to receiving that restoration is spelled out to Israel. We could learn from that too. Humble ourselves, pray, seek God's face, turn from our wicked ways. What if the global pandemic is something that God has allowed to bring us to humility before Him? What if God were speaking to us this morning? I want to tell you, my hope is in the Lord. And I am hopeful for the future because God is in control. And I am also expecting that we have a role in that. It looks a whole lot like God's people humbling themselves and praying and seeking God's face and turning from our wicked ways. Who's with me in that? James says in chapter 4, verse 7, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord. He will exalt you. This morning it might be that you are having a bit of a Nebuchadnezzar moment, and you realize it is time to lift your eyes heavenward. God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. If you find yourself in that position this morning and need to humble yourself before the Lord, to turn your eyes heavenward, to seek His restoration. We want to help you in that journey of faith to Him. If you're looking to find out more about becoming a follower of Jesus today, would you please help us by responding to some of the prompts that we put on the screen, inviting you to email us, to contact us through the website, to call us. We want to begin a dialogue with you. We want you to see what God has to say about following Him, about the path to restoration that He promises for any who will come seeking Him. Maybe that's you today. If it is, please, let us hear from you. Thanks for being here this morning.